July 26, 2025. Stavropol, Russia, 540 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. One of the most important Russian military factories, which produces systems to protect Russian forces from Ukrainian drones, is destroyed in a surgical precision strike. But this explosion was not an isolated case. At that very moment, more than 500 kilometers away, in the Sumy region, something even more devastating was happening to the Russian army, something that forced even Russia's most fervent supporters to admit defeat. To understand the importance of this event, we need to look at Kursk, in Russia. In this region, about 50,000 Russian soldiers were concentrated with an apparently solid plan to create a protection zone at the border, and more importantly, to force Ukraine to keep its best troops away from other important fronts. It was a strategy that had been working for months. But the Russian commanders made a fatal mistake. On July 24th, overconfident in their numerical superiority, they launched an offensive that quickly turned into what the Russian soldiers themselves called a bloodbath. And here's the first problem. The Russian reserves were positioned too far from the front line to react quickly. And with that, Ukraine realized the opportunity. Instead of just defending themselves, they executed something brilliant, an operation that the military calls active defense. But what does that mean in practice? Well, the Ukrainians did exactly the opposite of what the Russians expected. Instead of building fixed defensive lines and holding their ground, they deliberately retreated from some positions, pretending to be in withdrawal. The Russian soldiers, seeing the Ukrainians apparently fleeing, aggressively advanced to occupy the abandoned ground. It was a perfectly calculated trap. As the Russians advanced deeper and deeper, their supply lines, such as the convoys bringing ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements, became increasingly stretched and vulnerable. At the same time, the Ukrainians were luring them into terrain they knew better, where they had prepared firing positions and knew exactly where to attack. Apparent territorial disadvantage into a decisive tactical advantage. The Russians thought they were gaining ground, but in reality, they were walking straight into an ambush. And do you want to know who led this counteroffensive? The answer will surprise you. The 225th Ukrainian Assault Brigade. If you've never heard of it, I need to show you what this unit represents for Ukraine. Originally, it was just a territorial defense battalion from Kharkiv, formed in March 2022 by volunteers desperate to defend their city. But through the bloodiest battles of this war, like those that took place in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and the incursion into Kursk, they transformed into something completely different. Now commanded by Colonel Ole Shiryayev, equipped with German Marder vehicles and American Bradleys, the 225th had become an elite force. And on July 25th, they carried out an impressive operation, something that military analysts called a perfect pincer maneuver against the village of Kindrativka in Ukraine. A video was even posted on social media showing real footage recorded by the Ukrainian troops themselves, demonstrating the military precision of this operation. The way everything was done is impressive. First, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out surgical strikes to create panic in the Russian positions. Then, while the Russians tried to regroup, the 225th attacked from the flanks, completely surrounding the 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment. What happened next was devastating. The Russians were bombarded non-stop by high-mobility artillery rocket systems, high-precision artillery rockets that destroyed their artillery, while swarms of drones hunted down individual soldiers and vehicles. The Russian battalion commander, Andrei Yartsev, was killed in the battle. His troops, many of them poorly trained recruits, simply collapsed. And you can see the result of this operation now. This video, taken in the center of Kindrativka after the battle, shows the Ukrainian flag waving where the Russian flag once stood. Then, something almost unprecedented happened. The Russian propaganda channels on Telegram themselves began to admit the disaster. One of them wrote, "The fighters of the 310 Motorized Regiment, who held their positions until the end, remained permanently in the Sumy direction. Unfortunately, it was not possible to reach them." Now, stop and think. When propagandists admit that an entire unit was permanently lost, you know the situation is much worse than we imagined. But in this case, the Russian chaos was just beginning. While the 200th and the 225th were consolidating their victory, other Russian units in the region panicked. Reports from those same Russian military bloggers described scenes of total chaos, soldiers abandoning positions without orders, units firing at each other due to lack of coordination, and troops being killed by their own minefields that they had set up. A particularly bizarre case involved what the Russian military bloggers themselves called a race for glory between different Russian units to capture the village of Sak. Imagine that. Several military units competing with each other to be the first to capture an objective, each one wanting to take credit for the victory, whether to impress commanders, earn medals, or simply to have bragging rights. Instead of coordinating their attacks and working together, each unit was fighting on its own, without proper communication with the others. The result was disastrous. The 137th Airborne Regiment and the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade arrived at the village at the same time, coming from different directions, with no command coordination and without knowing there were Allied troops in the area. They literally opened fire on each other, thinking they were Ukrainian enemy forces. And while the Russian army was disintegrating on the battlefield, Ukraine was demonstrating a completely different military capability, the ability to strike at the heart of the Russian war machine. Hundreds of kilometers away. Do you remember the factory we showed at the beginning? Signal, in Stavropol, was not just any factory. It produced the electronic warfare systems that Russian troops relied on to protect themselves from Ukrainian drones. And the Ukrainians did not attack randomly. They specifically targeted the workshops that contained high-value computer numerical control machines. These are extremely precise, automated machines controlled by computers that can manufacture military electronic components with millimeter precision, such as chips, circuits, and essential parts for radar and electronic warfare systems. These are extremely expensive pieces of equipment and difficult to replace, especially for Russia, which is facing international sanctions. By destroying these machines, the Ukrainians disrupted production at its source. Watch this video. A compilation of several Ukrainian precision strikes against Russian military positions. Notice the difference. Specific military targets, calculated strikes, clear strategic objectives. Now, compare that with the Russian response. Frustrated with their defeats on the battlefield, the Russian commanders did what they always do when things go wrong. They attacked civilians. In Sumy, they used Grad rockets. Very inaccurate weapons. Even so, they were chosen to bombard dense residential areas. Imagine the tragedy. Hospitals, schools, markets, everything became a target. Subtitles by Adriana Zanotto. In Odessa, ballistic missiles hit the historic Privos market and apartment buildings, killing dock workers and entire families. American General Jack Keane explained the logic behind this strategy. He said they're trying to wear down the Ukrainians, to break the will of the Ukrainian people. But, as General Ben Hodges from the United States also pointed out, strategic bombings against civilians have never worked in history. They didn't work against the British in World War II, they didn't work in Vietnam, and they're not working in Ukraine. In fact, it's having the opposite effect. Each attack on civilians unites Ukrainians even more against Russia, but perhaps the most dramatic collapse has been in the information war. For years, the pro-war Russian channels on Telegram controlled the narrative, painting every defeat as a victory. But in Sumy, something different happened. Ukraine flooded social media with irrefutable visual evidence. Videos like the ones we showed before, with drones showing destroyed Russian equipment, images of soldiers advancing in helmets, photographs of Ukrainian flags being raised. A flood of evidence that completely overwhelmed the Russian disinformation machine. The Russian military bloggers panicked. Initially, they attempted to deny it, calling it fake or propaganda. When that didn't work, they tried to downplay it, saying that Kindrativka wasn't that important anyway. Finally, they started blaming each other, which sparked heated debates on Telegram channels. For the first time, even Russia's most fervent propagandists were forced to admit the reality. One of them wrote, "The situation on the Sumy front is deteriorating. The enemy is pressing not only with numbers, but also with quality." Now, stop and think. When your own supporters admit that the enemy has superior quality, you know you've lost more than a battle. You've lost the narrative. And it was at this moment of maximum weakness that international diplomacy came into action. Donald Trump saw an opportunity. On July 14th, he had given Russia a 50-day ultimatum to accept a peace agreement under the threat of very severe secondary tariffs. These tariffs had a target: Russian oil exports to China and India. Marco Rubio, the United States Secretary of State, was direct in his words, saying, "Patience is running out. It's time for some action." And it worked. Right after that statement, Putin agreed for the first time to sit at the negotiating table with Zelensky. Turkey announced that both leaders had agreed, in principle, to a summit on Turkish soil, with Trump himself participating. But here we have a problem. Both sides remain adamant in their positions. Putin still demands that Ukraine completely withdraw from 4 provinces and renounce NATO. Zelensky still demands a total Russian withdrawal and a return to the 1991 borders. So, why did Putin agree to negotiate now? The answer may lie in the destroyed fields of Sumy, where the 30th Russian Regiment was annihilated, and in the rubble of the signal factory in Stavropol, where Russian military capability was attacked at home. The Battle of Sumy was not just a tactical victory. It was a turning point that exposed many cracks in the Russian army. Poor coordination, low troop quality, failures in military intelligence. It was also a demonstration of the growing sophistication of the Ukrainian forces and their ability to turn defense into a devastating offense. More importantly, it was the first time the Russian propaganda machine was forced to admit a defeat, since they could no longer hide or justify it. The war goes on, but something fundamentally changed in those July fields in Sumy. The question now is no longer whether Ukraine can resist, but whether Russia can adapt to a new reality where its former advantages no longer guarantee victory. Now, I want to know your opinion. What caught your attention the most in this story? The drone attacks? Or maybe the fact that the Russians themselves admit the problems? Leave your opinion in the comments below. If this video helped you better understand this complex situation, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more analysis on geopolitics and international conflicts. And share it with anyone else who is interested in these topics. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.